In this next video, what we're going to be doing is understanding academic views on media effects, and particularly the academic controversies over the case that media content can cause antisocial behaviour. But the overall message that I want you to take away from this is there is a great deal of controversy over the nature of media influence. But also that no one thinks that there's a magic bullet. No one thinks that the effects of media occur, if they do, through the force of media alone. Everyone sees that there's a complex interaction on the question of media influence between media and other factors in society and culture. So let's move on and see what the critics have said about those things. So I think that one of the things that we need to do in our essays is that one of the skills that I've identified is the ability to identify key kind of what I've called killer quotes, quotes that neatly summarize a range of issues concerning the phenomenon that you want to explore. And I suppose the thing that I'm trying to illustrate in this video is that where we come across concerns that certain types of media content or technologies are directly to blame for, or significantly to blame for, certain kinds of social ills and social risks, and where we come across this idea quite often in media, when you look at the academic studies, the case is far more complicated. And I think this is best illustrated in regard to the work of Albert Bandura. Now, Albert Bandura is famed for his social learning theory of media influence. And what you have here is a YouTube video that shows his famous Bobo doll studies, which was a set of studies that looked at if showing violence to primary school kids on screen encouraged them to behave violently in the real world. And if you go to the Prezi, you can watch the video. This is Bandura talking about his experiment himself. And these experiments are of enormous historical significance, because whenever there's a debate about whether or not media have direct effects on behaviours, this is the Rosetta Stone, if you like. This is quite often the study that people identify as being emblematic of everything that's either right or wrong with experiments on media effects. So this is a classic kind of experiment where you have a group of people who are exposed to a stimulus. Their behavior is then observed after exposure to the stimulus. There's a control group who see something which is not violent, which is more benign, and then submitted to the same kind of test. And through this experimental model, which is explained more in the reading that you need to read, we can see whether or not the extent to which media are the sole contributors to the production of, in this case, violent behaviours. And one of the things that we know is from Gunter is that one of the problems with this approach is that experimental studies frequently come up with the strongest evidence of a relationship between exposure to violent media or sexually violent media or whatever it is, and the production of either antisocial attitudes or behaviours or aggression or whatever you have. But of course, what Gunter points out is the problem with this research is there is an essential problem of what we would call external validity. And what that means is we really have no idea as to whether the sorts of aggression that you see in experimental research is really a valid, a useful measure of the kind of aggression that we get in the real world. That's what Gunther is saying here, and that's the essential problem in effect studies. That is that, again, that those studies which find the most profound relationship between exposure to media violence and later aggression are quite often those where the measures of aggression are highly removed from the kind of aggression and violence that we see in the real world. And that is something that's explained more in the book chapter, which you must read. But the other significance of this particular study is that Albert Bandura didn't believe in direct effects. Albert Bandura, if you read his research, argued that in order for there to be a relationship between a young person seeing something violent on screen and then going out and behaving violently in the real world, a number of conditions need to be in place. That young person needs to see a parallel between what he or she is seeing on screen and their own social situation. They need to have a motivation for wanting to act out the violence, and they need to have an opportunity to act out on that violence. So if there is a relationship between screen violence and real violence, it's attenuated by a number of factors. And this is a really important point to note, because Bandura felt that fundamentally violence is a social issue. And so what we're talking about really is the extent to which media top up or don't a set of social tensions that already exist. So all of this is to make the point that really no one believes in direct effects, and we need to be really careful about looking at the way that the effects issue is reported in news and the things that are actually said in academic research. And quite often what you get are the kind of the highlights, some sort of very spectacular conclusions from media research. But when you dig down deeper into the studies, what you find is the picture is a lot more complicated. So let's look at some of the other criticisms of effects research. One of the very interesting arguments that's presented about research on the negative effects of media is that it's politically motivated. And we have two very, very important scholars here. On the left, we have Chris Ferguson. And Chris Ferguson is a leading critic of a body of research that is probably best represented by the gentleman to your right, Brad Bushman. And Brad Bushman, along with colleagues such as his colleague Anderson, argue that there is compelling evidence that, for example, in the area of gaming, a long-term diet of playing violent video games does lead to significant increases in real-world aggression. And Chris Ferguson has been a leading critic of this research. And he criticizes this on a number of levels. And we can distinguish these levels in two ways. Firstly, we can talk about the technical, and then we can talk about the political. And I want to focus on the political as things that are really kind of things that we can grasp perhaps a little bit more easily. So one of the things that Chris Ferguson argues is that really he echoes Gunther in talking about the validity problems of effects research. But he also argues that there's a political question here. Firstly, he argues that one of the reasons why there is so much evidence about negative effects is because it's easier to publish that research. There's another Australian researcher called Morgan Tier who's written about this also. Basically, that in the world of academic journals, it's tremendously difficult to have studies published that show no effects. That, for example, if you've done research on the effects of gaming amongst teenagers at a particular school and tracked them over a period of 4 or 5 years, and in that period you've seen no distinction in terms of real life aggression between the people who played a lot of violent video games and others who did not. It's actually quite difficult, Ferguson argues, to get that sort of work published. It's also incredibly difficult it's much easier to attract funding for research on the negative effects of media violence than it is to draw research on the positive effects of media violence. And if you think about something like gaming, there's lots of reasons to think that playing violent video games has certain positive social benefits. And then finally, if you come up with some kind of very spectacular headline finding about the negative effects of something like gaming, it's much easier to publicize that work. So our second criticism of effect studies is it occurs within a political environment where it's easier to pursue the negative effects question than it is the positive effects question. The other thing that Chris Ferguson argues is that, for example, in the United States, from which a lot of this research comes, there are political motivations, and by this he means federal political motivations to fund this sort of research. If we look at after the Newtown shootings, for example, we'll see the way that the NRA, organisations like the NRA, were keen to revive research into the negative effects of gaming because this was a way to detract attention from the question of gun control. So there's an entire political context around effects research that needs to be taken into context when you're evaluating this research. And so there are very real reasons for asking that the politics of media violence are far more interesting than the effects that it may or may not have on one or two people. Now, the other reason why this is important is the idea that the focus on behaviours distracts attention from less visible but more significant effects around socialisation. The key figure that I'm dealing with here is this guy over here, and this is George Gerbner. Gerbner argued that he began his research in the 1950s, and he quickly concluded that the question of whether television was very much the medium that he was funded to work on, and he was, in particularly in the 1960s, he received a great deal of funding to research the effects, firstly the amounts of violence there were on television, and secondly what its effects were. And he quickly came to the conclusion that the question of direct behavioural effects was the wrong question to ask about the significance of screen media. When he looked at American television, he argued that yes, indeed, American film audiences were in fact consuming huge amounts of on-screen violence. But he also observed that most of those people never went out and behaved violently. And also that when he sat down and looked in a very systematic way at this content, the most striking thing about this violence was that it seemed to be telling the same story over and over again. And that was a story about social power. When he looked at screen violence, it was basically a story, in his view, about white male power. More often than not, women were on the receiving end of violence. Women were far more victimized. Non-white characters were far more victimized. The idea was propagated that the urban world in particular was a scary place where crime was far more prevalent than it actually was in the real world. And so really the important question to ask was not whether this sort of content encouraged some people to be violent, but how it cultivated an entire political climate where the main features of that climate were fear, suspicion, hopelessness, racism, and sexism in particular. So he saw media violence as a story about power, and he saw its effect in terms of political socialization. It made us think about the way that the world worked in particular ways. So that seems to be a really old-fashioned story from the 1950s and about television. But it's interesting to note that the feminist games critic Anita Sarkeesian has made exactly the same argument about video games. In her website, Feminist Frequency, she talks about the main problems of gaming violence as not relating to the violent behavior of gamers in terms of real world aggression, but really talking about the sorts of messages that gaming sends about women. Again, the fact that women are far more likely, female characters are far more likely than male characters to be the victims of violence, and are quite often killed in highly sexualized ways. And it's important to note that even many gamers find this really quite offensive. And then the other fascinating thing that Anita Sarkeesian the point that Sarkeesian has made, has been the way that the sort of aggression one finds in online gaming communities, where there's a kind of a sexism and a lot of aggression, verbal aggression, written aggression, communicative aggression directed at women gamers. So again, what we're talking here is the idea that the significance of violence is more about socialization and political values than it is about direct behaviors per se. So just got a few quotes here from this excellent book, Media Effects, Advances in Theory and Research, just kind of summing up that no one really believes in direct media effects. So the quote up here is, "The notion that media have powerful direct effects on individuals is arguably more accepted by the general public than by scholars of media effects." And often the influence of media is determined by the social context of the user. So these are two particular ideas that I want to take forward into thinking about the case study of why rap is associated with violence and how rap comes to be used in violent circumstances. The overall message from this research is that no one believes in direct effects, that the question of effects is really deeply tied up in political questions about social power as they relate to both the academy but also to society in general. And the idea that media violence is best understood and described in terms of what it tells us about how society and culture is structured. So this signifies a really important shift of emphasis. We are not asking how media cause violence. We are asking how media is involved in conflict, how media becomes involved in social conflicts and in social tensions, and the political and social and cultural factors that involve certain kinds of media in certain kinds of conflict-based scenarios. So we'll be talking about that in the next video in relationship to rap.